Shankar Iyer on what Surjewala is saying about the taxation on crypto assets, that at this moment, we don't have the cryptocurrency bill. You're taxing cryptocurrencies. You don't know who the regulator is. You don't know how investors will be protected. But what we do know is that the government is considering that this is actually an asset, that it's somehow legal and will therefore be taxed. Shankar?
Is that for me, Rahul?
Yes, yes.
Some people need to update. The app on the Congress site needs to be updated. I mean, a lot of people have this confusion between what is a cryptocurrency and what is digital assets. So what is being taxed is, Bitcoin, Dogecoin, all the NFTs, which is basically all the paintings and mills. And so acquisition and transactions were not covered by any tax proposal, and that has been. It is a very interesting move. What the finance minister has done is she has ring-fenced all such transactions, isolated them, not given them any room to sort of breathe or be set off. And I suspect, and Subhash Garg might have some anecdote about this, is that these transactions will also lead to a lot of red flagging in the system. That said, I think the budget itself is continuity, and with the promise of PM Gati Shakti, which is basically speed. I said yesterday that the government must eschew the desired, the temptation to do something and wreck the sentiments. I'm glad that it hasn't done that. There are a lot of touch points in this. This is like a network budget, process budget. I mean, you could say that your car went into the service station and has come serviced, but if you were expecting your car to turn into a Ferrari, sadly you will be disappointed.
Shamika Ravi, you want to also give us your first reactions? We'll be joined in a moment by Shamika Ravi, but you've got two very clear views emerging. The opposition's adjective is lackluster budget. The government's is growth-oriented. And the truth often lies somewhere in between political views that are expressed by two sides. The markets, though, seem to be cheering the budget at the moment, Udayan. Where does that come from?
It's the growth orientation which I spoke about, Rajdeep, and the lack of any clear negatives. As I said in the morning, that the corporate sector is in pretty good shape. Earnings are going up, and that's what drives the stock market. So if the government had done anything which came in the way of fleshing out of the corporate earnings cycle or the expected capex cycle, that would have been construed as a negative. So, if the finance minister stood up today in the parliament and said, I have no budget to present, the stock market would have gone up, because the stock market basically was hoping that there are no negatives. It did not require too many positives because it was doing well in any case. Now, that's not the boat in which the MSMEs and the lower end of the pyramid were standing in. So the question has to be to them, are you happy with the budget? The stock market naturally is happy because no new negative like a long-term capital gains tax increase or any kind of corporate tax, etc. has not come in. On the margin, it is being helped by the infrastructure push of the government and the promise to expand capex by 35% in the current year. So that on the margin is positive for the corporate sector, and there are no clear negatives, and therefore the stock market is celebrating. And also on the fiscal front, there is a commitment to reduce it from 6.9 to 6.4%, which the stock market will like because it probably keeps bond deals in a moderate kind of space, and that is what they like to see as well. Now the question is whether MSMEs got enough, because there is an ECLGS scheme extension or expansion by 50,000 crores, taking it to 5 lakh crores. Now, is that enough, or could a lot more have been done on the SME front? And that, I think, is a very important question. On that, maybe I think the government might have come up a bit short.
Shankar Iyer, the budget speaks about special mobility zones, battery swapping for electric vehicles. To what extent do you think this might help speed up the transition and adoption of electric mobility in India?
So there are two kinds of infrastructure that is being created under the Modi government over the last 6-7 years. One is the physical infrastructure and the other is the digital infrastructure. So budget after budget, they try to punctuate or populate these pieces into play. So you have something like FASTag, which is now being used to collect toll. The same could be used now for swapping batteries, for charging stations, for parking, all kinds of activity or mobility. So they are creating opportunities. There will be some startups which will come and pick it up. I think the two big social infrastructure plays in this is the 200 channel thing for education, and the one big which will probably not get reported or not commented upon is the national unique identity for land transfers and land registration. It's like the Aadhaar for land trust. I hope the state governments implement it. A lot of the capex story in infrastructure, the devil is in the detail. One has to look at the documents and then figure it out. The budgets under this regime have often flattered to deceive. So we will have to see the numbers and then come. Second point is that most infrastructure, again, will have to be implemented by the states.
Udyan?
No, Rahul, I wanted to ask you and Rajdeep, because I may have missed the divestment target for the current year. Do you guys have that number readily? Because I heard us say that the LIC IPO is happening soon, but I didn't get a divestment number like it was 1.75 lakh crores last year. Did you know?
Let's ask Dr. Garg that. Did you pick up a number? We're waiting still for the budget intelligence dashboard to be updated with all of what is in the budget papers. But Dr. Garg, did you pick anything up on what the target would be?
I don't think they announced the disinvestment numbers at all. They didn't speak about the disinvestment. On the issue of the cryptocurrency, I think it's good that the finance minister has brought clarity that these crypto assets, the transfer long-term or short-term gains would be taxed at 30%, and there would also be tax collection at source of 1%. But this, and there was a lot of unclarity about it. These assets transfers were being taxed, but at different rates and kind of thing. Now, but what appears to me is that this is one of the harshest regime, so to say, on any financial assets transfer. Equity transfers are treated at 10 to 15%, and the bonds. So you have on long-term bonds are not sort of taxed at the high rate at all. So 30% tax and no set off for their losses to others, I think is going to get, as I said, the party may be getting over for the crypto assets transfer. So that's difficult situation. And I must also clarify, I think on capital expenditure, as I initially said, the 2 lakh crores is probably accounted for by the transfer to the assets of loans of about 1 lakh crores and the public sector substitution of their borrowings by green bonds. So if that happens, then there is no net increase in the capex expenditure. I think we'll need to see this in more details.
Saurav Majumdar, Dr. Garg makes the point that maybe Nirmala Sitharaman's been very harsh on crypto assets in comparison with how other asset classes are taxed. Given the fact that this was a regulatory black hole so far, what do you think of the impact this may have on crypto assets and their adoption in India? Saurav?
Well, I think, Rahul, that the aim was always very clear. Yes, I can hear you.
Go on.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Rahul?
I hear you well. Go on, please.
Yeah. I was saying, Rahul, that, I think the path on this front was very clear. When the Reserve Bank governor comes out and says that cryptocurrencies are a threat to financial stability, the Prime Minister gets into the act and also keeps a close watch on it. I think the thrust from the government side is very clearly for an RBI-related, digital rupee, which is the announcement also which has come. And therefore, cryptocurrencies per se are clearly being frowned upon. Now, unfortunately for the crypto players, this may not be great news at this point, but we will have to see the fine print on what and how it plays out. But I do think that the focus was very clear, and I think it is very clear that the government wants to push the Reserve Bank currency, cryptocurrency, or based on blockchain rather than the private currencies, which was always the case.
Shamika Ravi joins us.
So the taxation regime, therefore, will have to be is aimed at being harsh.
Let's look at to all of you, the best thing that you've seen in the budget and the worst thing. Shamika Ravi, what is it that stood out for you and what is it that perhaps didn't happen?
Well, I was happy to hear the overall increase in the capex, Rajdeep. I think that really signals, in fact, whoever coined the term booster budget, I think did a very appropriate, and I think the FM responded in the same spirit, because it really is a continuation of what we saw last year, or the clear strategy that I've been speaking about. The strategy is clear. It is going to be infrastructure spending strategy out of this slowdown. And the belief is that it will be this capex and this nature of spending on big infrastructure that will create jobs, etc. I'll tell you, sometimes, and I often see this when people discuss budgets, we want many things from this one speech. So, for instance, on the schooling, the fact that supplementary teaching material is going to be made available to children, etc. I'll tell you, the frustration right now in the system is children have been at home for now 2 years. The supplementary material available over television is really not the substitute. But then I think this is where we know that there are limitations to what the FM can do and what is the role for Ministry of Education and for state governments, frankly. So, frankly, schools have to reopen. TV materials being available academically is not the solution. I really like the emphasis on marginal things, which are typically marginal, like mental health. I'm glad we are talking about building core network capacity, which addresses counseling, issues of mental health largely in the country. Finally, we are talking about specific sectors. We've had broad MSME strategies, from a fiscal perspective, but we're talking about specific sectors like hospitality, which are yet to really emerge out of the slowdown. Then the whole emphasis on ease of doing business 2.0, because while a lot of compliances and conflicting laws, etc., have been done away with, there still remains a large work to be done. And I think, again, putting the focus back on that is good. I like the idea that urbanization is finally getting the due attention that it deserves. We have been so focused on rural India that I think urban planning, urban governance, etc., have really just happened organically, and we have not given it the kind of thought. And I think this year that focus has been put on.
The not so good news?
One small thing.
The not so good news?
Aspirational districts. Districts are very large in India, right? So I'm glad that finally we're putting focus where it ought to be. It is aspirational blocks program. Now, Madhya Pradesh and a couple of other states have had this for some time, but really we have to get into that mode of precision policy making now. And I'm really glad on that count that the FM addressed a lot of these issues.
The not so good news?
The schooling, but then, as I said, I don't know if it is her mandate. What can finance minister do about schooling? Of course, we would have liked to see a more comprehensive strategy on education. I think, almost everyone who speaks about the budget and the economy and real economy at large does talk about quality of jobs. So she did address on many counts the issue of skilling. But education, remember, is the core of that. In many cases, skilling is trying to redo or undo some of the damages or gaps that education system leaves. So the kind of focus we really need as far as government schooling is concerned, or even higher ed. Last year, for instance, we saw some of those announcements. This year, we haven't seen that much in terms of spending. But yeah, I think that is one. The second, also, I think I'd like to focus a little bit on health. Now, last year, we made a promise that every district hospital in the country will now have an infectious disease ward. And that is a great, it's not only infrastructure creation and capacity creation for public health at district levels, but we don't know eventually what happened with that program. And that is why I was also talking yesterday that sometimes in these budget speeches and announcements and economic survey, we have to make an effort to also talk about what has been done as far as some of the core announcements which were done last year, for instance. So what has been the effectiveness? What has been the impact? So I don't know. I mean, those are some gaps. We announce these things, but it would be nice to know what has been the progress beyond the announcement as far as health and education are concerned.
That's precisely it. You've spoken about 200 television channels for e-Vidya. I'm not sure whether that's going to be enough to overcome the wide digital divide. And really the crisis that education has faced in pandemic times, and ditto with health. We need to know what are the actual outcomes when it comes to education and health. Social sector is where there has been questions over the government, just as there has been praise for the government on physical infrastructure. But Udayan, you wanted to ask a question to Mr. Jain, who is joining us.
No, Rajdeep, I also want to point out, I mean, while we are talking about the social sector, one very key number in the budget always is the gross market borrowing for this government for the next year. And that has been pegged at 14.95 lakh crores, if I'm not mistaken. Now, that is way above what the market's expectation of 13 lakh crores was. And at this point, it would be useful to see what the bond is doing, the benchmark bond, because I think bond yields would have gone up on the basis of this development. The fact that the gross government borrowing actually calendar is much ahead of what the street was penciling in. And this is a key threat to this year's economic progress in 2022. If bond yields continue to rise, because inflation is already quite elevated, and you have a gross market borrowing from the government which is also higher than expectations, then you can create an interest rate system which is quite elevated, and that might be growth impeding. So on one hand, you're trying to stimulate growth on capex, but on the other hand, if your actions and borrowing lead to some kind of hardening of bond yields in the system, that might come in the way. I think one needs to be a bit wary about that. And if you say Nirmal Jain has joined in, maybe that could be my first question to him. Nirmal, if you can hear me, have you taken a look at the gross market borrowing from the government, and is it higher than expectations? Is it leading to any kind of hardening in the bond yield today?
No, it's definitely higher than expectation, but there was always a trade-off. And because this year, I mean, of course, on the lower base of last year, we got 9.2% GDP growth. So either you maintain the momentum, and which also has positive impact on jobs and a cascading impact on other sectors. So I would go with this, that at any point in time, any finance minister will always have a trade-off, either to give support to growth or worry about inflation. But given the fact that bond yields have been still in a comfortable range, so if you go back to say earlier crisis of 2008 or even earlier in the taper tantrum of 2011, bond yields were hovering at a much higher level, around 8%. So by that yardstick, I think the finance minister would have been in a zone where probably she could have taken some chance with the bond yield. And I have a feeling that if this year they did a lot of groundwork on disinvestment, but they could not achieve the target. And a lot of this disinvestment will get pushed to the next year, which will give leeway to the government to make sure that the bond purchases or borrowings or inflation, they don't go out of control. From that perspective, I think there's always, and what market was expecting, most of the economists probably would have supported this as well, that we are coming out of pandemic, and the last thing that you want to do is that slow down the growth momentum, given that exports are going for it. Exports are growing at a very reasonable pace. The tax buoyancy is very good. In fact, the capex increase of almost 35% is way above anybody's expectation. So, the government's intention is very clear that they want to pump prime the economy with a lot of support to capex and make sure that there's a cascading impact on the jobs and income levels.
Okay. Ashok Wadhwa of Ambit has also joined in, and he is a veteran of many budgets. Ashok, I want to bring you in on this 30% crypto tax first. There are two ways to look at it. One, of course, is to say, it is much higher than long-term and short-term capital gains tax on equities or even bonds. But the other way to look at it is that most people don't look at cryptos as a long-term asset or even a short-term asset. They trade in it. And trading income is probably at par with what you pay if you're trading derivatives on in equities as well. So is 30% fair in that light, or would you say it's a harsh taxation, even penal?
There are two things here. First, there is an acknowledgement now, even before we actually have the cryptocurrency law, through the budget, the government is, in a sense, acknowledged that there is some element of legitimacy to the whole crypto debate that's been going on. So that's point number one. Government is treating trading in crypto as a speculative game. And as you know, government historically has always distinguished, even if you take AIFs, if you take AIF 3 versus AIF 2, AIF3 is taxed at the maximum marginal rate, particularly where there are long shorts. So the government treats anything which is speculative in nature as a bit undesirable. And in an effort to therefore discourage that undesirable trading, government always levies a higher tax. So I think there is easy and quick justification for why trading in cryptos is being, not trading in virtual assets is being treated at a higher than normal tax rate. The other thing, of course, is that they have also levied a TDS on it, therefore ensuring that people who were kind of getting in and getting out because of ease and not having to really make any reporting now are conscious of the fact that any trading in virtual assets is going to lead to a tax inquiry and that there is a tax obligation. So there are two parts to it. And I think, as I said, given government's historical view that we want to discourage speculation, it's a fair rate of tax, I would argue.
You know, the other thing, Ashok, which has been creating a lot of problems or actually has raised concerns in the last couple of budgets is the fact that import duties had been taken up, presumably to support Atmanirbhar Bharat and import substitution, etc. This time too, there is a mention of on capital goods a 7.5% import duty, and eventually even on capital projects, capital good projects at 7.5%. Do you have clarity on that, and could that be something which industry may not like?
I haven't seen the fine print to the end, but I did see two things. There was a increase in certain aspects, so project finance and some specific infra-related projects have seen a movement upwards on import duty. But I also saw that there was a reduction in certain instances. For example, steel was one instance where I thought I heard the finance minister say that she's reducing. I think that's taking into account and recognizing the fact that there is a challenge to the supply chain and that expensive inputs are going to become more and more difficult. Can you hear me?
Right. Rahul?
Hello?
Yeah, we hear you well. The other interesting thing is that she's tried to ensure that there is no sudden disruption, there is no unexpected policy change, which is what several people wrote about as well, that she just needs to keep it steady, she needs to keep it on par. And does that then, in some senses, Shamika Ravi, take away from a part of the buzz, the hype that budgets have been associated with? Because one of the things that not just Nirmala Sitharaman, but has been the general direction of Modi government budgets is to take the hype away from the entire budget making process, to make it as factual, as predictable as possible.
Frankly, I think that is the aim, Rahul. It is the more minutiae you go into, the more over obsessive the government is about small details. That much more complications are very costly, and it leads to greater volatility and uncertainty in the market. So I think the whole effort over the last 7-8 years have been to gradually ease up and make things much more broad brushed and simpler. And again, on that count, I'm glad we continue to move towards that direction, even in this budget.
In a sense, that's a departure from where we started. If you remember, the original Arun Jaitley budget was criticized for precisely tinkering too much. And I think over the years, the government has realized that rather than tinker, you might as well focus on your key areas and give a broad direction through the budget. We'll do so much else outside it. Mr. Garg, you were part at that time, and there was a lot of debate over the budgets, the early budgets of the Modi government. You think the Modi government over the years has gone, as Rahul said, to realize that let's just give a broad direction from the union budget, and we'll do most of the difficult work outside the budget?
I'm not getting sound now.
You can't hear me, Mr. Garg? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Mr. Garg, do you believe that there's been a shift in focus of the Modi government? The first couple of years, there was a lot of tinkering around and criticism of the Modi budgets as a result. Now they've decided, let's not use the budget for deciding on every policy instrument, just provide a broad framework and then do most of the tough decisions outside the budget.
So that is true. In earlier years, the government targeted specific sectors and went with numerous announcements, very intense announcements. For example, if you look at first 3 or 4 budgets, there was so much of agriculture, there was so much of agriculture schemes around. But now in this budget, there is nothing for the agriculture. Likewise, so much for the MSMEs, industry, infrastructure, but everything seems to be approach is necessarily a good approach, because you have to communicate. When you spend about 35 to 40 lakh crores of the GDP of the country, that income, and you have to address the numerous issues from infrastructure investment to industry to people to bottom of the pyramid and all, I think you need to communicate. The kind of budget speech today was virtually a complete reversal of what it was earlier.
I want to go across to Ayush Ailavadi, Business Today's tech editor, because lots of questions are coming to us thick and fast on what this digital currency, the digital rupee that the government has spoken about in this union budget will actually mean. So you have payment wallets of the likes of Paytm and the others that already exist, Ayush, and now the RBI is working on a digital currency. What does this really mean for people who are watching? How will this work?
So Rahul, in terms of the nuances of the CBDC, this is something we've been seeking clarity on for a long time. Even now, in terms of the announcements from this particular budget speech, all we've gathered is that the RBI will be introducing one such thing. What we can gather from examples around the world is that this will be an equivalent, so to speak. So when we are using the blockchain, these transactions will make it a lot more efficient and transparent. It'll be a lot more accountable, and there'll be more transparency in terms of cash management systems. But in terms of the other announcement, which is very different, so to speak, in terms of what's happening in the crypto world, and a lot of players have been responding on Twitter and the like, and there's been memes galore. In terms of what this means for India's crypto investors, there's a question that a lot of people seem to be asking, and that is that with this 30% tax on income from cryptocurrencies, will this really be counterproductive in terms of will this actually drive a lot of transactions underground, and does this eventually mean that tax evasion would rise? That's the question that a lot of people are asking when you zoom out and you consider that short announcement in the budget speech when it comes to crypto.
But how would tax evasion rise now that you're being taxed? If people have been spending their part of their salaries on different kinds of crypto assets, you will have to pay the tax. So unless you come up with some other way of being able to purchase without going through regular informal channels, you will now have to pay a tax whenever it is that you get out of a cryptocurrency.
Rahul, a lot of people have been using over the years around the world the way crypto works on the blockchain. It does become a little difficult to ascertain how these transactions are actually taking place. A lot of them use peer payment systems. There are apps in the US that people were using all along who were largely immune to this in terms of how they were withdrawing that income and using it in different markets around the world. Binance was one example where people were using things in the US, very different from our Indian players, and the way we were actually using wallets, normal wallets like MobiQuick and stuff like that, to actually use exchanges in India as opposed to ones abroad. The question is in terms of OTC markets, right? Really go into underground OTC markets, and will this mean that a lot of those international systems will be used? And also in terms of how you can use cryptocurrency globally. If you can't use it in India, there are places around the world where you can make crypto payments and do things. So a lot of that, the concern is that if it does shift to those underground OTC markets, then what does that mean in terms of the smaller players, the average young Indian who's invested in the crypto markets out here using an exchange, the likes of CoinSwitch or Xerex or the others? What does it mean for them in terms of taxation? And yes, it is a very exorbitant, flat 30% rate that would spook the markets, so to speak.